Snow was falling outside the thick glass window, but it was the first time Leora had ever seen it fall for real, not in a picture or a report. She pressed one long finger against the cold pane and watched the white flakes spin and drop past the lights of Frostholm Station. On her homeworld, weather did not surprise anyone. It was managed, predicted, controlled to the smallest degree. Here, on this rough little outpost carved into the ice of a border moon, the humans seemed to enjoy not knowing exactly what the sky would do next. Beside her, wrapped in a thick blanket meant for a much larger creature, Flint made a low sound in his throat. He was small for a Draken, barely the size of a large dog, with dark green scales that shimmered faintly under the station lights. His clawed hands gripped the edge of the blanket, and his eyes, slitted in gold, watched the flickering string of lights someone had hung along the corridor ceiling. Leora crouched beside him. "They are only for looking," she said quietly, though she was not entirely sure that was true. She had read about this human holiday before arriving, but reading about a thing and standing inside it were very different experiences. The files had called it Christmas. They had used words like joy and giving and family. None of the words had prepared her for how loud and warm and messy it actually felt, even from a distance. Flint pressed closer to her side. He did not like bright, sudden light. He never had, not since she had found him 3 months ago in a supply crate meant for medical evacuation, the last living hatchling from a nest destroyed in the fighting on his homeworld. The Karsu had no place for him. Neither, strictly speaking, did the humans. But Frostholm Station had taken them both in any way, and Leora still did not fully understand why. A door at the end of the corridor slid open, and a woman walked through with her arms full of tangled wire and small glass bulbs. She was tall, with short dark hair and a coat 2 sizes too big for her, clearly borrowed from someone else. She spotted Leora and Flint and grinned like she had been hoping to find them. "There you are," Grace said. "I was starting to think you two were hiding from the whole thing." "We are not hiding," Leora said. "We are observing." "Sure you are." Grace crouched down slowly, the way a person might approach a nervous animal, and set the tangle of lights on the floor between them. Flint's nostrils flared, but he did not pull away. "These are for the tree in the common hall. Owen's fixing the wiring so they don't spark. Want to help me untangle them?" Leora looked at the mess of wire. It seemed pointless, difficult, and entirely without purpose. And yet she found herself reaching for one end of it anyway. "I do not understand this holiday," she admitted, pulling a loop of wire free. "Your files describe a birth, a season, a set of customs, but they do not explain why so much effort goes into small, useless things. Wire that only holds light. Paper wrapped around gifts that will be unwrapped in a day." Grace laughed, not unkindly. "It's not really about the wire or the paper. It's about doing something for people you care about, even if it doesn't make perfect sense. Especially if it doesn't make perfect sense." She glanced at Flint, who was watching the two of them with cautious interest now, his tail curled tightly around his own feet. "How's he doing today?" "Better," Leora said. "He slept without waking twice this time." "That's good. That's real good." Grace's voice softened. "You know, Owen's still nervous about him. About the fire thing." Leora's shoulders tensed slightly. She had heard about the meeting 2 days ago, the one she had not been invited to, where some of the station's residents had raised concerns about housing a fire-breathing predator species so close to their children. She understood the fear, even if it frustrated her. Fear rarely listened to explanation. "Flint has never breathed fire," she said carefully. "Draken younglings do not develop that ability for years, if ever, in his line. And he has shown no aggression toward anyone." "I know that. I believe you." Grace reached out slowly and set one string of lights near Flint's paws, letting him sniff at the cool, dark bulbs before she plugged them into a nearby socket. They came alive in a soft, steady blue, nothing like a sudden flash. Flint flinched, but did not bolt. His eyes fixed on the glow, curious despite himself. "See," Grace said gently, "not everything with light is dangerous." Leora watched Flint's tail slowly uncurl from around his feet. It was a small thing, but she had learned to notice small things with him. Progress here did not look like victory. It looked like a tail relaxing, a breath slowing, a creature choosing to stay instead of run. "Owen is building something for the tree," Grace continued, winding another string of lights around her arm. "Some kind of surprise. He won't tell anyone what it is yet, not even me. and I live 2 doors down from his workshop." "A surprise," Leora repeated. The concept still struck her as strange, withholding information on purpose, for pleasure rather than security. But she found she wanted to know what it was anyway, which was its own kind of strange. Outside the window, the snow kept falling, steady and unhurried, covering the frozen ground in a soft, deepening white. Leora did not know yet what Christmas would ask of her, or of Flint, or of this small, stubborn, generous community that had folded them both in without asking for anything in return. She only knew that for the first time since she had arrived at Frostholm Station, she was not counting the days until she could leave. She was, against all her training, looking forward to what came next. The common hall smelled like cut pine and hot cider, though nothing on Frostholm Station had ever grown as tall as the tree standing in its center. Owen had built it out of salvaged metal struts and dark green fabric, shaped branch by branch until it looked almost real from a distance. Children ran circles around its base, tossing paper snowflakes into the air, while 2 older residents argued cheerfully about whether the star on top should face the door or the window. Leora stood near the edge of the room, watching the chaos with the same careful attention she gave to any new phenomenon. Flint sat beside her on a folded blanket, his tail flicking now and then at the sound of laughter, but his body no longer pressed so tightly against her leg. That, she had come to understand, was progress. "You're staring again," said a voice behind her. Nadia had a habit of appearing without warning, usually with a data pad tucked under one arm and a look on her face like she had already solved 3 problems before breakfast. "I am observing," Leora said, which was becoming something of a running joke between them. "Sure." Nadia crouched down near Flint, moving slowly the way Grace always did, and offered the back of her hand for him to sniff. He considered it for a long moment before allowing his snout to bump gently against her knuckles. "He's warming up to people faster than I expected." "He is warming up to some people," Leora corrected. "Owen still keeps his distance." Nadia's expression flickered, just slightly. "Owen's not a bad man. He's just careful. We lost someone on this station a few years back, before you arrived. An accident with an unstable cargo shipment. Fire got out of a containment unit faster than anyone expected." She glanced at Flint. "He's not against your boy specifically. He's against being surprised by fire again." Leora absorbed this quietly. She had assumed Owen's caution was simple prejudice, an old fear of anything unfamiliar. She had not considered that it might be memory instead. Memory, she was learning, shaped human behavior far more than logic ever could. "I have been reading about Draken biology," Nadia said, straightening up and tapping at her data pad. "Trying to understand him better, since none of our medical files cover his species. Found something interesting buried in an old exploration log. There's a stage of development in young Draken called an ember bloom." "I am familiar with the term," Leora said. "It is mentioned briefly in Karsu records. A natural event, tied to safety and belonging. It rarely occurs outside a Draken family group." "Right, that's the thing." Nadia turned the data pad so Leora could see the notes scrolling across it. "From what I can piece together, it's not dangerous. It's actually the opposite. It's supposed to be a comfort response, something that happens when a youngling finally feels secure enough to let go of certain defenses. Warmth, light, that kind of thing. But it needs trust. A lot of it. And usually a guide from his own kind, someone to walk him through it so he isn't scared of his own body." Leora looked down at Flint, who had settled into a loose curl on the blanket, watching the tree lights with drowsy interest. "He has no one from his own kind. Not anymore." "I know." Nadia's voice was gentle. "That's what I keep thinking about. If it ever does happen to him, out here, with none of his own people around to explain it, he could panic. Or the room could panic around him. Either way, it wouldn't go well unless someone was ready for it." The weight of that thought settled over Leora slowly. She had spent months protecting Flint from obvious dangers, from cold and hunger and careless hands. She had not considered that one of the greatest dangers to him might come from inside his own growth, unfolding at a moment no one could predict, with no elder of his kind present to soften it. Across the hall, Owen was standing on a short ladder, adjusting a string of lights near the top of the tree. He caught Leora's eye for just a moment before looking away, his jaw tight. It was not hostility, she realized now. It was worry, worn into the shape of distance. "Does he know?" Leora asked. About the ember bloom? Not yet, Nadia said. I only found the records this morning. I wanted to talk to you first, since he's your responsibility. She paused. Our responsibility, I guess, now. This station doesn't really do things halfway once it decides to care about someone. Leora thought of the meeting she had not been invited to, the quiet arguments that had happened behind closed doors before she and Flint were ever formally welcomed. She understood now that it had not been a vote on whether to accept them. It had been a vote on how to protect them properly, weighed by people who took protection seriously because they had once failed at it. Flint stirred on the blanket, blinking sleepily up at Leora, and let out a small huffing sound that was, she had come to learn, something close to contentment. She reached down and rested a hand lightly against his back, feeling the faint warmth of his scales beneath her palm. We should tell Owen, she said finally. All of it. The ember bloom, the risk, everything we do not yet understand. He deserves to prepare, not to be surprised. Nadia smiled, small and tired and a little proud. Now you're starting to sound like one of us. Outside the tall windows of the common hall, the snow had not stopped falling since morning, gathering in soft drifts against the outer hull of the station. Inside, the tree lights glowed steady and warm, and for the first time, Flint did not flinch when someone laughed too loudly nearby. He simply watched, ears low, tail still, learning slowly that not every bright and sudden thing in this world meant harm. The workshop beneath Frostholm Station's main deck always smelled of hot metal and oil, a smell Owen found more honest than the perfume of pine and cider drifting down from the common hall above. He liked working with his hands on something that made sense, something with edges and joints and clear right answers. People were harder. People carried histories that did not show up on a diagram. He was halfway through soldering a small copper frame when the door slid open and Leora stepped inside, with Nadia close behind her. Flint was not with them this time, left resting under Grace's watch, and Owen noted the absence with a small, private relief he immediately felt guilty about. We need to talk to you, Nadia said, without her usual easy smile. About Flint. Owen set down his tool carefully, giving himself a moment before he answered. If this is about the meeting, I already said my piece there. I don't have anything against the kid. It is not about the meeting, Leora said. Her voice was steady, but there was something careful in the way she chose her words, the way a person moves when carrying something fragile. It is about something that may happen to him, something none of us are prepared for. She explained the ember bloom the way Nadia had explained it to her, plainly and without embellishment. A natural stage of growth, a release of pin-up defense, expressed as warmth and light. Something meant to happen gently, guided by family, and safety. Something that could just as easily go wrong if it happened suddenly, without warning, in a room full of people who had already once lost someone to fire. Owen listened without interrupting, his arms folded, his eyes fixed somewhere on the workbench rather than on either of them. When Leora finished, he was quiet for a long moment. So what you're telling me, he said slowly, is that at some point, without much warning, that little guy might just start glowing and heating up, and none of us will know if it's supposed to happen or if something's actually gone wrong. Essentially, Nadia said. But if he's calm going into it, and if there's something familiar nearby, something that already looks and feels safe to him, it's supposed to be gentle. It's the surprise that makes it dangerous, not the event itself. Owen looked down at the copper frame on his workbench, half-formed, still waiting for the small lens and battery core he had ordered weeks ago for an entirely different purpose. He had been planning to build something simple for the tree, a lantern shaped like an old human ship's lamp, just another piece of decoration among many. Now, looking at it, he saw something else. The Draken homeworld, he said. Does anyone know what the sky looks like there? What kind of light he'd recognize? Leora blinked, caught briefly off guard by the shift in his attention. I have seen images. Before the fighting began, observation drones recorded the surface. The primary star is dimmer than yours, more orange. The nights are lit by a wide band of luminous cloud, something like your aurora, but slower, steadier. Steady light, Owen repeated. He picked the copper frame back up, turning it slowly in his hands, already reworking the shape in his mind. Not a flash, not a spark, something that builds soft and stays soft. Nadia exchanged a glance with Leora. Owen, what are you thinking? I'm thinking I've got 2 weeks until the gift exchange, a workshop full of scrap parts, and apparently a very good reason to finally use them for something that matters. He set the frame down and reached for a datapad, already sketching. If he's going to have this Ember Bloom thing happen sometime, better it happens because something in the room already feels like home to him. Better than it catching all of us off guard in the middle of dinner. You would build this for him, Leora said. It was not quite a question. She had expected caution from Owen, more distance, more careful words about risk and safety measures. She had not expected him to reach immediately for his tools. Look, Owen said, not quite meeting her eyes now, his focus dropping back to the sketch forming under his stylus. I lost someone to fire on this station once. Fast, careless, out of nowhere. I don't ever want to feel that helpless again. But there's a difference between fire that happens to you and fire that's part of who somebody is. If I can build something that helps him feel safe instead of scared, that's not weakness. That's just doing the job right. Nadia smiled, the tired, satisfied kind of smile she seemed to save for moments like this. Welcome aboard, properly this time. Owen allowed himself a short, almost embarrassed laugh. Don't make it weird. Leora watched him work for a while longer, sketching, measuring, muttering measurements under his breath, and found herself recording none of it in her usual analytical way. She was not thinking about data points or cultural observations. She was thinking about a man who had once lost someone to fire, choosing now to build a lantern for a creature made partly of it, simply because it might help him feel less alone. It was, she thought, a very human kind of courage, quiet, stubborn, and entirely without need for an audience. Above them, muffled through the deck, came the faint sound of the common hall settling into evening, footsteps and laughter fading as the station's short daylight gave way to its long winter dark. Somewhere up there, Flint was curled beside Grace's fire-safe heater, unaware of the quiet plans forming for him 2 decks below, plans built not from fear, but from the stubborn, deliberate decision to care. By the time evening fell on Christmas Eve, the common hall had filled with more people than Leora had ever seen in one place on Frostholm Station, all of them carrying dishes covered in cloth or foil, filling the air with smells she still did not have proper words for. Someone had strung extra lights along the ceiling beams, and someone else had pushed the long tables together into one uneven line, mismatched chairs crowded around it from every corner of the station. Leora sat near the end of the table, Flint curled at her feet on a folded blanket, half asleep despite the noise around him. He had grown used to the sound of many voices at once, she had noticed. It no longer made his ears flatten the way it once had. You're not eating, Grace said, sliding into the seat beside her with a plate stacked high with food Leora could not fully identify. I am unfamiliar with most of this, Leora admitted, looking at the spread before her. I do not know which parts are meant to be eaten together, or in what order. Grace laughed. Honestly, nobody really knows. You just eat what looks good and go back for more of whatever you like best. She nudged a small dish closer to Leora's side of the table. Try that one. It's sweet. Kids usually fight over it. Leora tried it cautiously. It was, indeed, sweet, almost uncomfortably so, and yet not unpleasant. She found herself reaching for a second small serving before she had finished processing the first. Around them, conversation rose and fell in overlapping waves, stories about past holidays, gentle arguments about whose recipe was better, laughter breaking out over some joke Leora had missed the beginning of. She found she did not mind missing it. There was something comforting in simply being present for the sound of it, whether or not she understood every part. Partway through the meal, Grace reached beneath the table and produced a small, carefully wrapped bundle, setting it in front of Leora without ceremony. This is for you. Figured you'd rather I just hand it over than make a big scene out of it. Leora looked at the wrapping, simple brown paper tied with plain string, and felt an unfamiliar hesitation settle over her hands. I did not prepare anything for you. You don't have to. That's not really how this works. Grace's voice was easy, but her eyes were watching Leora carefully, the way she often watched Flint, gauging comfort rather than pushing for a reaction. Go on. Open it. Leora unwrapped it slowly, and used to the motion, the paper crackling softly under her fingers. Inside was a small woven cloth, hand-stitched, bearing 2 patterns worked carefully together, one she recognized as a common Karsu symbol for kinship, the other a simple human star, the kind used on the tree above their heads. The stitching was uneven in places, clearly done by hand rather than machine, imperfect and deliberate all at once. I had to guess at some of it, Grace admitted, a little sheepish now. Found the kinship symbol in one of your reports. Hope I didn't get the shape wrong. Leora ran her fingers over the stitched pattern and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not immediately know what to say. She had received formal gifts before, official tokens exchanged between diplomats, calculated and precise. She had never received something made slowly, by hand, simply because someone had wanted her to feel seen. You did not get it wrong, she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. You got it exactly right. Grace's smile was soft, a little relieved. Good. I was worried. Before Leora could find further words, a ripple of attention moved down the table as Owen stood, holding a larger package wrapped in dark green paper, awkwardly shaped, clearly handmade rather than store-bought. Conversation slowly quieted as people noticed him moving toward the end of the table where Flint lay curled against Leora's leg. I know I wasn't exactly first in line to welcome the little guy, Owen said, his voice a touch rougher than usual and used to holding a room's attention. Figured it was time to fix that properly. He crouched down slowly, the same careful, unhurried movement Grace and Nadia had taught themselves months ago, and set the package gently on the blanket in front of Flint. The hatchling lifted his head, nostrils flaring, ears twitching at the unfamiliar shape and weight of it. Leora felt her chest tighten, all her earlier ease draining away in an instant. She knew what was inside that wrapping, or thought she did. She knew what Owen and Nadia had spent 2 weeks preparing in the workshop below. She had agreed it was the right thing to do. She had told herself she was ready. Sitting here now, watching Flint's claws hesitate over the edge of the green paper, watching every eye in the hall turn toward him with quiet anticipation, she realized that knowing something was right and feeling ready for it were not, in fact, the same thing at all. Go ahead, Grace said softly, kneeling beside Leora now, her hand resting lightly, steadying, on Leora's arm. We're right here. All of us. Flint's claws closed around the edge of the paper and slowly, carefully, began to pull it apart. The paper came away in uneven strips, torn by careful claws rather than practiced hands, and beneath it sat a small lantern shaped from hammered copper and pale glass. It was no larger than a 2-liter container, its curved sides etched with a soft, wandering pattern that looked, if one looked closely enough, like drifting cloud. Nestled inside, behind the glass, sat a slow, steady light, dimmer than any bulb strung around the hall, colored a warm, deep orange that pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat rather than a flame. For a moment, nobody in the common hall moved. Flint stared at the lantern, his gold eyes reflecting its low glow, his tail gone completely still against the blanket. Then, without warning, his scales began to change. It started small, a faint shimmer along his spine, easy to miss unless you were watching closely, as Leora was. Then the shimmer deepened into a soft inner light, spreading slowly down his sides, warming the dark green of his scales into something closer to amber. A low heat rose off his small body, enough that Grace, still kneeling close beside him, drew in a sharp breath. Is that? Someone near the far end of the table started, their chair scraping back too fast, too loud. Everyone stay where you are, Nadia said, her voice cutting cleanly through the rising murmur, calm in a way that demanded calm in return. Nobody moved toward him. Nobody panic. Owen had gone very still, crouched exactly where he had knelt to hand over the gift, his eyes fixed on Flint with an expression somewhere between fear and awe. Leora saw his hands curl briefly into fists at his sides, old instinct fighting against new understanding, before he forced them open again and stayed exactly where he was. Flint let out a small, startled sound, more confusion than pain, and pressed himself instinctively backward, away from the light he himself was producing. His claws scraped uselessly against the floor as though trying to escape his own skin. Leora, Grace's voice, low and urgent, cut through the fear rising in Leora's own chest. He needs you. Now. Leora moved without further thought, sliding down onto the floor directly in front of Flint, placing herself between him and the room full of frightened, watching faces. She did not know, in that moment, whether she was protecting him from them or protecting all of them from a misunderstanding about to happen. Perhaps both. Flint, she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached toward him. It is not hurting you. I promise you, it is not hurting you. He flinched from her touch at first, his small body radiating heat now, the amber glow spreading fully across his scales, brightening slowly rather than flaring. But he did not pull away entirely. His gold eyes found hers, wide and frightened, searching her face for some sign of what was happening to him. This is not the fire that hurt your family, Leora said, keeping her voice low, steady, certain, even though certainty was the last thing she truly felt. This is something else, something that is only yours. Beside them, the lantern's steady orange light pulsed once, twice, matching, she realized with a start, the rhythm of the glow now spreading across Flint's scales, as though the two lights had found each other and begun, very slowly, to breathe together. Look, she said softly, guiding his gaze toward the lantern rather than away from it. It is the same light, the one from your sky. Owen built this for you. He wanted you to see something familiar, so that whatever happened tonight, you would not be alone in it. Flint's trembling slowed, his claws unclenching slightly against the floor. The heat radiating from his body did not fade, but it steadied, no longer climbing wildly, settling instead into something warm and constant, closer to sunlight than to flame. Around the hall, the frightened murmuring had softened into something closer to stunned silence. No one moved to douse him with water or reach for an extinguisher, though Leora could see several nervous glances toward the emergency equipment mounted near the door. Nadia stood close, monitoring quietly, her expression easing bit by bit as Flint's glow leveled out rather than spiking further. Slowly, gently, the light along Flint's scales rose into the air above him, small drifting motes of warm amber breaking free like sparks that did not burn, floating gently upward toward the ceiling of the hall before fading softly into nothing. It was, Leora realized, watching in stunned quiet along with everyone else, breathtakingly beautiful. Not a disaster at all. A release. A first breath of something Flint had carried, unspoken and unexplained, since the day she had found him alone in that crate. The drifting lights rose higher, mixing with the strings of lights along the ceiling until it was difficult to tell which glow belonged to the tree and which belonged to the small, trembling creature curled now, exhausted but calm, against Leora's side. Flint let out a long, shuddering breath, and for the first time since she had known him, he did not flinch at all when Grace reached out and laid a gentle hand against his back. "There he is," Grace whispered, her voice thick with something between relief and wonder. "There you are, little guy." Around the hall, someone began, quietly and a little unsteadily, to clap. Others joined in, hesitant at first, then warmer, until the sound filled the common hall the way the lights had, unplanned and unrehearsed and entirely genuine. Owen finally let his shoulders drop, some old, tight thing in his chest loosening for the first time in longer than he could remember. Leora held Flint close, feeling the last of the warmth ease out of his small body, and understood, with a clarity that startled her, that she had just watched something far larger than a single frightened creature finding comfort. She had watched an entire room choose trust over fear, together, all at once, without needing to be told how. Morning came quietly to Frostholm Station, the kind of quiet that only followed a night everyone remembered clearly enough not to need discussing. Snow had kept falling through the dark hours, piling soft and even against the outer hull, and when Leora finally stepped into the common hall, the lights from the night before were still strung along the ceiling, dimmed now to a gentle glow that no longer startled anyone who passed beneath them. Flint lay curled near the base of the false pine tree, pressed against the small copper lantern Owen had given him, its light turned down low but steady. His scales had returned to their usual dark green, the amber glow from the night before fully faded, though Leora thought she could still see faint traces of warmth lingering beneath the surface, like embers settling after a long, gentle burn. He lifted his head when she approached, ears perking, and made the low huffing sound she had come to recognize as something close to greeting. He did not flinch. He did not press himself smaller against the floor, the way he once had whenever someone new entered a room. He simply watched her come closer, tail giving one slow, easy sweep against the tile. "You slept well?" she said, settling down beside him, resting one hand lightly against his back the way Grace always did. His scales were warm, but only in the ordinary way now, nothing like the wild heat of the night before. He's been like that since sunrise, Nadia said, appearing with 2 mugs of something hot, offering one to Leora as she sat down nearby. Wouldn't leave the lantern's side. I think he likes knowing it's there. Leora accepted the mug, still unfamiliar with most human drinks, but no longer hesitant to try them. Do you believe it will happen again? The ember bloom. Eventually, probably. Younglings usually go through a few smaller ones before it settles fully. Nadia glanced toward Flint, her voice softening. But he's got people around him now who know what it is. That's the difference. That's what he didn't have before. Owen arrived a short while later, hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets, looking more rested than Leora had seen him in weeks. He crouched a careful distance away from Flint, an old habit not yet fully broken, and offered a small nod when Flint lifted his head to look at him. Hey, Owen said, a little awkward, clearly still working out how to speak to a creature who, only hours earlier, had glowed like a small sun in the middle of dinner. Lanterns holding up okay? Flint's tail swept once against the floor, slow and deliberate, and after a moment, he shuffled forward just enough to rest his snout lightly against Owen's boot. It was not much. It was, Leora understood, watching Owen go very still with surprise, exactly enough. Yeah, Owen said quietly, clearing his throat. Yeah, okay. Good boy. Later that day, once the hall had been swept clean of torn wrapping paper and the last of the holiday dishes had been returned to their owners, Leora sat alone in the small quarters she shared with Flint, a data pad open in front of her, waiting for the report she was required to send back to Karsu Command. She had drafted dozens of these before, always measured, always precise, stripped of anything that might read as sentiment. She began typing, out of habit, in the same clinical tone she always used. Subject continues to exhibit normal development. No signs of hostility. Environmental integration proceeding as expected. She stopped, looked at the words, and deleted them. Instead, she began again. Last night, the youngling in my care experienced his first ember bloom, alone, without any elder of his own kind present to guide him through it. He was not alone in truth. A station full of humans who owe him nothing chose to stay close, to remain calm, to build something with their own hands simply because they believed it might help him feel safe. It did. I do not have adequate words in our language for what I witnessed, only that it resembled something closer to family than protocol. She sat with that for a long moment before sending it, uncertain how Command would receive it, uncertain if it even mattered how they received it. It was, she realized, the truest report she had ever written. Outside her small window, the station's lights glowed steady against the deepening winter dark, and somewhere down the corridor, she could hear laughter drifting from the common hall, someone already planning next year's decorations, as though this year's had not just ended. Flint stirred beside her, resting his head against her leg, and let out a long, contented breath. Leora did not know, not yet, what this single quiet holiday might set into motion. She did not know that her report would eventually reach eyes far beyond routine command, that a small, stubborn human station's willingness to stand beside a frightened drake and hatchling would one day open doors between 3 very different peoples who had never before found reason to trust one another. She knew only this, that for the first time and longer than she could remember, she was not counting days until departure, and neither, she suspected, was Flint. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless, promising, in its own quiet way, that there would be another winter after this one, and another after that, for as long as this small found family chose to stay together.